Okay, perfect. So before we dive into what we're going to be talking about today, we wanted to do a land acknowledgement as this is only the first step to decolonization. We recognize that we collectively benefit from the ongoing displacement and genocide of the indigenous people of this continent. This land was and continues to be of great importance to Native nations, and we hold a collective responsibility to acknowledge this crucial aspect of racial justice and commit ourselves to supporting Indigenous sovereignty wherever possible. I'm currently in Los Angeles, which means I am occupying Chumash and Tongva land.
I'm in central Illinois, so I am occupying Kaskaskia and Kickapoo land. Okay, so we do have a live chat box, so if at any time you have a question, a comment, anything like that, please feel free to let us know in the chat. And that brings us to our overview of today's webinar. So there's going to be a brief presentation section, about 20-25 minutes from me and Carlene, and then we'll dive into a panel section where our panelists will answer questions and talk about their experiences. We just completed our introductions. So next, Carlene's going to talk about American history and culture and how both things have contributed to the experiences faced by LGBTQ plus people, immigrant people, and people who lie in that intersection. Then we'll talk about the mental health issues that can be faced by people in this identity. And finally, we'll talk about how this manifests into adulthood.
Okay, yeah, with that, we can go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have a wonderful group of people here, so whenever you guys are ready, feel free to unmute and just introduce yourselves very briefly. We can go in order. B, if you want to take it away.
Is my Wi-Fi alive?
Yeah, you're chilling.
All right, so I'm B, I use they, she pronouns. I'm in San Diego, that's Kumi Island. And I am going into my 4th year at San Diego State University, majoring in nursing and minoring in counseling and social change.
Hi, I'm Maya. I use she, they pronouns. I am from Chicago, and I will be starting my first year at University College London, studying history and philosophy of science in the fall.
Hi, my name is Misi. I'm 16 years old. I use they, she pronouns, and I'll be a rising junior at Hopkinton High School.
I'm Venus. I'm currently going to my 3rd year in the fall at Stanford. I study product design with a minor in feminist and gender studies.
Great, thank you all for being here. And with that, we can just dive right into the topics we're going to cover today in this presentation. So before I begin, why does this matter to us? Why are we even talking about queer and immigrant identities and how they intersect? As we were creating this webinar, Anush and I wanted to highlight how undiscussed this intersection can be, despite the fact that it affects so many individuals like our panelists today. We hope that this event can offer some semblance of community and support for anyone that falls within this demographic, as we understand how impactful the dissonance and oppression you face on a day-to-day basis can be. We hope that you enjoy the topics we're covering today and come out of it with a better sense of who you are and how your identities interact and intersect. Okay, great. So to start us off, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ plus immigrant identities in American history and culture, starting with these 3 amazing individuals on the screen here who have all made their own impact in their own ways. So we can start with the individual on the right, which is Jose Sarria, who was the first openly gay candidate for public office. His mother was born in Colombia and fled to America after the Thousand Days War. And he's known for performing as a drag queen in San Francisco and for his refusal to be silenced or shamed, despite the oppression and backlash he faced. He's said to have set the stage for Harvey Milk, who would later become the first openly gay elected official. Next in the middle is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was the son of Haitian and Puerto Rican parents and a prominent artist in the 1980s. He's regarded as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, particularly of the neo-expressionist movement. His ex-partner and lifelong friend spoke openly about his bisexuality, which makes him a role model for queer children of immigrants everywhere, particularly those who see themselves as artists. And last but not least, we have Rina Sawayama, who's actually the feature of Dawn's newest lesson plan. Just dropped the link in the chat, a little plug. But she's not actually a part of American history and culture. She's a Japanese British artist who saw a rise to fame after her debut album, Sawayama, was released in 2020. Her songs feature many relevant themes, including the disillusionment faced by queer children of immigrants when trying to reconcile their home cultures with their new ones. Yeah, with that, we can move into the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today, starting with the basic overview of American policy and law regarding these communities and how they came to be through the processes of anti-queerness and Eurocentric standards. Okay, we're going to start off with a short timeline of America's history with immigrants. Obviously, this is a very condensed version of America's policy regarding this population. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but I've highlighted a few that I think were particular watershed moments in America's history regarding immigrants, starting with the 1790 Naturalization Act, which excluded non-white people from the eligibility to naturalize. We have the 1924 Immigration Act, which decreased the annual immigration cap and explicitly favored migration from Northern and Western European countries. We have more recently the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Responsibility Act, which increased enforcement at the border and mandated fences on the southwest border. And the 2012 to 2014 DACA Act, which was an executive action by President Obama that allowed undocumented young adults to apply for temporary deportation relief and a work permit. Oh, sorry, I didn't even realize the slide had changed. And here we have a short timeline of America's history with the LGBTQ plus community. Again, I'll just run through a few of them. We have the 1969, the infamous Stonewall riots in NYC, which led to 4 days of struggle between the police and the LGBTQ plus community. In 1977, as I mentioned earlier, when Harvey Milk became the first openly gay person to be elected to public office. And in 2015, which I'm pretty sure a lot of us remember, when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in all 50 states, which was definitely a turning point in terms of the gay liberation movement. While we're on the topic of talking about queer American history, I very quickly wanted to spotlight this event since it's often overlooked in recounts of the queer liberation movement. Just a quick trigger warning, the following slides contain descriptions of violence against the LGBTQ plus community. Here we can see the Snake Pit Bar, which is a bar in New York, where in 1970, police raided and arrested 167 queer individuals. Among them was Diego Vinales, who was an Argentinian immigrant, and in a panic over the possibility of being deported, Vinales tried to escape the jail and was subsequently impaled on an iron fence below. When word had spread that Vinales was in the hospital, the Gay Activist Alliance was incited to organize a march of more than 500 people on the police station. I like to spotlight this event since it inspired a lot of LGBTQ plus people to become politically active, including many who had not done so following the Stonewall riots 8 months prior. Yeah, and here we have just a few images of those riots led by the GAA in honor of Diego Vinales. Okay, so with all of that said, I talk about the snake pit and these laws to say that oppression is not a competition. As we saw in the happenings of the snake pit, our identities as queer individuals and our identities as immigrants or children of immigrants intersect in a multitude of complex ways. The fear that Vinales felt when threatened by the possibility of deportation and the forces that put him in jail in the first place for being a gay man are not by any means mutually exclusive. We must recognize the importance of leaning into this intersectionality and realizing how that affects the way we move through the world and how the world affects us. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how these laws and ideas came to be using the nuclear family as a microcosm. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, nuclear family refers to the family structure that emerged during the Great Depression era. It usually consisted of a pair of adults and their socially recognized children. And the adults in this family were more often than not a married man and woman. So from the get-go, we can see how this westernized standard for family life ostracized queer individuals as it typified and reinforced roles set for each given member of the family. We have like a patriarchal role, a matriarchal role, etc., which just perpetuated the heteronormativity that became a feature of American culture. At the same time, this kind of dynamic established by the nuclear family differs greatly from the extended family model that is prevalent in a lot of other cultures, including Hispanic culture, African culture, Asian culture, etc. Unlike the nuclear family, where there's a clear authoritative figure that diminishes once the children become independent, other cultures took on a much more reciprocal relationship, where extended family members take on a crucial role. I'm sure that many of you have seen and experienced these dynamics firsthand. Speaking personally, I know that a lot of my extended family members in the Philippines still play a very crucial role in the decisions my family makes on a day-to-day basis. So these differences in family style and culture are only a few examples of the pillars for xenophobia and anti-queerness, as both immigrants and queer individuals are seen as too foreign or deviating from the norm. They also serve as the main source of the issues brought about by acculturation, or the assimilation of one's culture into a more dominant one, which Anusha will cover in the following slides.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Carlene. So as Carlene was saying, all of these aspects of American culture and history directly contribute to mental health phenomena experienced by immigrants and their children. So we're going to talk about two key concepts, which definitely do not sum up the expanse of experiences that immigrant children will face, but they are really important for this specific intersection. So the first is acculturation, which is used to describe the assimilation to a different culture, typically the dominant one, which is really just a fancy way of saying the way that people from different cultures will alter their view of what a norm is in order to fit with the dominant culture. In this scenario, it's American culture. Then we have generational dissonance, which is described as the divergence of views between adolescents and parents that is common in families of American parents and their American-born children. For example, if you immigrated here from India, let's say, your parents may have a different idea of what is acceptable and what is not, and that can cause issues in the family dynamic because of the different ideas of what is socially acceptable. So here we aim to explore how these immigration-related topics affect queer children of immigrants in particular. To do this, we're going to break down acculturation and generational dissonance in various immigrant groups, which this definitely isn't an exhaustive list of all of the different types of immigrant groups, but they're used to explain how this can affect different immigrant groups in different ways. So to start, let's talk about Arab MENA Americans. This group of people are likely to face social isolation for their perceived ethnicity and or religion. We can see this has been amplified after 9/11 when many people who are perceived as being Middle Eastern or Muslim were attacked for simply existing in the American realm. However, being queer in these situations can lead to internalized homophobia and other mental health issues due to feeling isolated in both their families, as queerness is a very stigmatized topic across many cultures, and the larger American community, ultimately either being alienated by their families for their queer identity or the American community for their Arab MENA identity. This results to many children clinging to the familial structure for relief from social isolation. However, the generational dissonance experienced from differing ideas of what is acceptable in society and what is not, combined with the queer identity, leads to a further regression from strong familial relationships. For Asian Americans, it was found that this demographic was more likely to experience considerable levels of psychological distress and clinical depression as a result of lower acculturation rates. Social support, often gained from assimilating to the American culture, decreased mental health issues in the demographic. However, the divergence from their parents' culture and their expectations from a cultural standpoint as a result of acculturation, caused its own issues in the children of many Asian immigrants. The presence of queerness as an identity accelerates feelings of a detachment from the familial structure when it interrupts the norms of the immigrant parents' culture. For Latinx immigrant Americans, intergenerational conflict was common due to several issues. For one, varying language preferences in the household. For example, if English was more comfortable for the children of immigrants versus Spanish for their parents, there was generational dissonance. Additionally, different experiences within American culture, assimilation, and prejudice increased levels of stress in Latinx youth. These stressors, combined with the additional queer identity, increases the relevancy of generational dissonance and interfamilial conflict in the Latinx family structure. Finally, African Americans, in reference to first and second generation African American immigrants, in this demographic, there was a unique dilemma in that the experiences of African American immigrants were consolidated with the larger Black non-first, second generation immigrant community. However, these experiences still remain divergent from both the greater Black community and the greater American culture. Racism faced by African immigrants was reported to be the greatest acculturation-related stressor, and this can lead to mental health issues developing in the children of immigrants. As the immigrant child questions their complex identity in American culture, queerness may become another source of stress for the child as they grapple with how their identity will be perceived by their less acculturated parents. All of these words simply mean that generational dissonance as a concept is accelerated by familial structures that do not support queer children. Many queer children of immigrants growing up in America may question their familial relationships and their cultural standards as they explore their identities. This isn't meant to scare you, it just means that it is normal, valid, and expected to feel confused and worried throughout this process. However, the intersection of queerness and being an immigrant of color is a beautiful identity, even if it does come with challenges. So if we connect the immigration-related phenomena with the LGBTQ plus experience, we find that alongside the challenges of acculturating while being a child of immigrants in America, the added stressors associated with navigating sexual orientation and gender identity can cause generational dissonance with the parent and increase mental health issues in this demographic. Now we're going to transition into our adulthood segment by talking about how the previously mentioned acculturation, and more specifically acculturative stress, manifests in adulthood. So acculturative stress simply is just the stressors associated with being an immigrant or ethnic minority and going through the acculturation process. So we talked about how queerness can be a part of acculturative stress if you don't have a familial structure that supports you. Then this can also manifest into generational dissonance, social isolation, and mental health issues. In adulthood, these queer children of immigrants will have a varying success because despite all that we've said, this demographic is not a monolith in the least. Depending on income level, familial support, and education quality, the children of immigrants will have differing experiences in adulthood. For example, families with more generational dissonance will often result in children with a lower quality of life. So if your family isn't prepared to accept your identity, be that queer, non-queer, etc., it will be harder for the children of immigrants to be successful in adulthood. But that doesn't mean they won't be successful at all. It does take accepting the identity and accepting that there are cultural differences for the children of immigrants to sometimes break out of the cycle. Families with more generational consonance will often result in children with a higher quality of life. So in comparison to generational dissonance, generational consonance is just when families have a similar level of acculturation throughout, which means that the families are better equipped to accept their children regardless of identity. Therefore, they have more familial support as they grow. Now we're just going to talk about some anti-immigrant propaganda in the lens of substance abuse. So in adulthood, a lot of children of immigrants will suffer with the consequences of ingrained biases in American culture. Although statistics show that first and second generation immigrants are considerably less likely to partake in drug use in comparison to non-immigrant Americans, there remain popular stereotypes that tie certain immigrant groups with excessive drug use. For example, let's unpack the usage of the word marijuana and the correlated shift in the perception of Mexican American immigrants. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, recreational drug use was popular and more socially acceptable than it possibly is now. As a result, many lower class minority people were partaking in recreational drug use, as was the norm. However, at this time, cannabis was incredibly popular, and anti-cannabis organizations like nicotine organizations did not want the other side to profit. And they saw that lower class and particularly minority communities were more likely to engage in marijuana or cannabis use instead of nicotine use because of its affordability. So to combat this usage and to proportionately disadvantage minority users, there was a change from a usage of the word cannabis to marijuana. At this time, there were many different names for anything containing THC or CBD, but the word marijuana was most popular because Mexico's proximity to the US was very close, and that way Mexican people could be scapegoated for marijuana-related crimes. So since the word marijuana sounded the most Spanish, it was the one that was picked up and used with most frequency. So again, negative language was used to associate Hispanic people with crimes committed while under the influence of marijuana, although it was particularly lower class Mexicans who worried about the drug the most. The alleged side effects of marijuana or cannabis changed as it became a more controversial drug. For example, in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, the side effects of cannabis were often described as making the user sleepy and hungry. However, as it started being referred to as marijuana and conflated with the Mexican community, it began being used to talk about violent crimes committed while under the influence of really any drug, not just marijuana. So Mexico did begin cracking down on marijuana usage before the US, but the damage was done because the usage of a Spanish-sounding drug made Mexican people more vulnerable to harmful stereotypes and violence. This is relevant today because Mexican American immigrants, especially in adulthood, will struggle with the consequences of these biases, especially in communities that haven't stood up to these stereotypes.
Okay, I know that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So we're going to take a little pause, just like take a little breather and end this presentation on a happier note. And in doing so, I'm going to cover the immigrant paradox, which is basically a phenomenon that comes from a study done by the National Institute of Health, where researchers found that first and second generation immigrants were less likely to be diagnosed with a mood, anxiety, or personality disorder compared to native born Americans. As inferred by the name, this feels very paradoxical or counterintuitive for the reasons that Anusha stated earlier when talking about the stresses of acculturation, since they usually have negative effects on our mental health. However, the study speculates that individuals' connection to an immigrant community through their parents' culture acts as a protective device, leading to better mental health overall, as they're able to find a group of people that they can relate and identify with. So despite the daily hardships and oppression that we face, we must always remember that there is so much power and beauty in your identity, and it's always something to celebrate about yourself. So yeah, with that brings us to the end of the presentation. We hope you enjoyed all of the information that we covered. And Anisha, we have one more slide, right? Yeah.
Okay. So the presentation portion is over. Thanks for sticking with us. We hope you learned something fun and new, although some of the topics were a little bit heavy on the soul. We just wanted to spotlight an organization real quick. We had previously partnered with them, and they're called the Family Acceptance Project. They're a nonprofit organization based in a San Francisco university that focuses on increasing family acceptance and support of LGBTQ+ children of diverse backgrounds through connection and research. So this organization does do a lot of research on family dynamics. It's a really strong suit for them, both in America and outside. And they do work on helping LGBTQ plus children, especially with immigrant parents, reconcile with their families who maybe aren't able or willing to accept their children. So if you would like to reach out to them or visit their website, Carlene can drop the link to their website in the chat, and their email is also on the screen if you would like to take a screenshot or a picture. I'll give you guys a second. All right. Here are all of our sources. If you are interested, it's been broken down by slides that have information. This presentation will also be made available at the end of the webinar if you are interested. So thank you. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out at our Gmail. If you would like to become an organizer, the link is also here. If you're a teacher, we have an allies group on Facebook, and all of our socials are the same, except for Twitter, which you can see.
Yeah, Anisha, I think we should, we can like pause on this slide really briefly because it was lagging a little bit. But if anyone wants to like take a screenshot or
Okay.
like jot something down, yeah. Here's all of our information where you can reach out. And thank you again for listening to our presentation. Again, we hope you enjoyed it and learned something new about yourself or about American history and culture.
Yes, but do stick around because we're going to be moving on to our panel section soon.
Okay, great. Yeah. Like Anusha said, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this webinar now. If you have any questions, feel free to just like unmute or drop it in the chat. But if not, we do have some pre-prepared questions that we're going to offer to our panelists so that they can just do kind of at an open table. So you can do so now. If you have any questions for our 4 panelists, that'd be great. Just drop them or unmute. We'll hang around a bit. Okay, thank you, Ari. We have our first question, which is, what's something you love about your identity? And I really don't want to be that type of person who like puts people on the spot. So this is very voluntary. Panelists, whenever you feel so inclined, just unmute and go for it.
Oh, you can go.
Yeah.
Well, I'm South Asian, so my dad's family's from India and my mom's from Pakistan. So I'll just say, just being able to grow up around those cultures, like especially like the food and like just being able to like, I guess, come together as a community around food is also cool. Also, just growing up in Chicago, like I was raised in Chicago, so I'm actually do get to learn more about our own culture like all the time too, which is always something really cool. Especially my parents are from my mom also has relatives from India and they're very different parts of India. My dad's North Indian, my mom's South Indian. And so it's like a very wide array of very different cultural aspects. And so it's just very cool to be able to say, oh, this is like one part of the world, like 2 countries, but there's so very much different aspects of it. And just to being able to be like, oh, all of that is like a part of who I am. That's really cool.
Something that I really like is like, so I'm originally from Nicaragua. I guess like something a little different about me is like, I'm not like first generate, like I'm not, my parents don't live here. Like I'm the only person who lives here. So I guess like it's kind of, it's bad and good, but I really enjoy like being able to feel what it's like to like be in between worlds, even if like it kind of sucks that I have to be closeted at home. But it's also just like being able to come to America and like experience something completely different has been really enlightening, especially because I was the first person like in my close friend group in Nicaragua to like come out and like realize that I was gay. And I'm also now kind of able to like help my other friends that like ended up like coming out to me from home, which has been really nice because I feel like very well equipped, like having come here to like a more liberal space. Because if you don't know, like Nicaragua was like a heavily conservative and like religious country, so it's not very like accepting of gay people at all.
Okay, thank you. Oh, we have a new question. What's one thing you wish you were taught what's one thing you wish you were taught slash you saw in a classroom growing up?
Okay, I can answer this one. I wish I was taught that LGBTQ figures of color actually existed, because my school did a pretty okay job teaching about people of color, and my school did a pretty okay job teaching about LGBTQ figures, but that's debatable. But I wish they like I wish they included LGBTQ figures who were of color, who were diverse, because most of the LGBTQ representation in media is predominantly white and able-bodied. And whenever I would like look for LGBTQ media, I was never included. So that was a very tough thing to handle with. Like as a child, I didn't even think I was LGBTQ because all the characters and all the members that I saw were white.
I can say that I wish that they went over some other terms, at least mention them, because I knew the word gay. Didn't even know the word lesbian for a while. Was in high school, that's when I learned bi was a word and existed. And most of the terms that I learned were all from the internet or my other gay friends talking about these words to me. But even when I looked it up on the internet, their understanding of the words weren't what was on the internet. So there was a lot of disconnect because no one formally goes over these things and teaches that they exist and that they're valid and real.
Kind of going off of Amisi's point, that immigrant identities are not a monolith. I was particularly flat out told by my preschool teacher that I couldn't be Asian because I didn't have fair skin. Um, so it's just like I and like I grew up in a pretty liberal place. I like to think we like to call ourselves like a liberal bubble in Illinois, but um, it's just very interesting to think like a lot of curriculums would like only if we ever talked about immigrants, it was like one specific unit in history class, and it was like the specific unit like on like third wave immigration or first wave immigration or whatever in APUSH. So just to be able to talk about the fact that there have been immigrants in the US for a long time, and there's a lot of really interesting history about that. And they weren't just like this one specific identity. Kind of like Amisi said, there's a lot of queer immigrants in history, a lot of women immigrants in history that we don't talk about. So yeah, that would have been nice to learn more about.
Maybe this is just my specific experience because I did go to like a Catholic school, which is very common like in Nicaragua, but I just kind of wish I hadn't been taught a lot of things that I was taught. Just because they just teach us so much. Like I mean, I'm thankful to like have figured out like my sexuality in high school, but there was so much like internalized homophobia that I've had to like unpack over the years, and just such a huge disconnect that I feel from like my community because of that. And like I just kind of wish that I had been able to foster a community within like my place of origin, as opposed to like having to search for it in like other places, even if I'm grateful for like the community that I've been able to build around myself like today.
This is really good input. Thank you guys so much. Um, Another question that we have is, how do you personally stay true to both of these identities? So both staying true to the queer community and also your cultural identity from your families.
I mean, personally, It's just allowing them to coexist and know that they don't cancel each other out or invalidate each other. I know when I was growing up, all the gay people that I did see on Filipinx television were comedians and the comedic relief in movies and such. When I was figuring myself out, I had internalized this as gay people are only here and exist as a joke. So it was very difficult to accept that both of these things can exist in my person because it felt like my Filipinx side didn't want to acknowledge my queer side as deserving and human. So that was very difficult. Just accepting that I can be queer and I can be Filipinx without needing to just be reduced down to the joke that I saw growing up.
Thank you for sharing that. And like, first of all, like, thank you for modeling vulnerability. I'm also Filipinx and I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, you know, Vice Ganda, like that was probably the only like queer representation I ever saw on like Filipino media. Yeah, and I just want to thank again, like all the panelists for being so open about sharing your experiences. Um, I actually have another question, and Venus mentioned earlier that she has to be closeted at home, which kind of ties into what I'm going to ask about. So I'm just curious about how you've personally dealt with obstacles like lack of familial support as a result of like your identities intersecting or as a result of your queerness, and how that like has shaped your mental health and how you've kind of confronted that over the years.
I think in my case, I was like physically isolated from my family also because they're not here. But I feel like just even like when I've been with them and like just emotionally isolated from it, it just, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of like mental health stuff over the years that like I've been able to more or less sort out. Like it's an everyday thing. But I find that it's just so like you really need to find a friend, or like ideally like find friends that like understand what you're going through, even if they're not necessarily like, because especially I don't know what it's like in other schools, but at least like at Stanford it can be very isolating to be like queer and like international, because it's like there's not a lot of us, and it's just especially isolating. So I've had to find friends that like maybe fit into like one category or the other, but they still get it and like are still able to support me. But it's still like just kind of very hurtful to be like isolated from your family in that way, especially because it's kind of like an entire part of my identity that I like identify so strongly with. But I'm not able to share it with them at all, and I'm not sure if like I'll ever be able to share it with them, even if like I share so much more with them. Like it's still really hard and like something that I haven't quite figured out how to deal with, even like after so long of like having both identities like intermix and like exist with each other.
That is so interesting. I would have no idea. Thank you so much for sharing. Wait, Amisi, did you unmute?
Yeah. Fortunately, I'm out to my parents, but I'm not out to extended family. And honestly, I don't know how I'm going to deal with that because I'm not close to most of my extended family anyway, and I'm genuinely not sure how they would take this. So I just like don't. So I just probably won't tell them because I don't. Because in my case, I think coming out is kind of dumb because why? Because why do I have to go through the pressure of coming out and finding someone that affirms my identity when you should already be affirming my identity by default? So I eventually adopted the mindset is that if someone asks me my identity, I'll just tell them straight up because I don't care anymore. But considering my family comes from a country where being gay could land you in prison and possibly a death sentence from your community, I probably won't end up telling them anyway. But but nowadays I consume more diverse media. Like I've made friends who are also LGBTQ people of color. Like unfortunately I can't meet friends that tick every checkbox, but finding ones that do is helpful than finding those that don't fit any checkboxes.
So I'm both lesbian and ace, and I came to terms with my ace identity way before like anything else. And so I think around eighth grade, I think something came up in conversation. It's like, oh yeah, that's what fits me, and it did not go over well. My parents just flat out told me that is not an identity that exists. I should not be identifying with that, and so they have probably grown since then, especially my mom. I think she's a lot better about it, but I'm like, I'm at a place where it's like, do I really want to be talking to you about this considering last conversation we had? So yeah, I've just really just grown to find like a much more community at school among my friends. I also just found like a really supportive friend group of other queer people of color, especially that have that's a really important community to me. I do a lot of musical theater and like music stuff. And so through that, I've been able to find a lot of communities that have found that support.
Okay, so we had an educator ask in the chat if any of you guys had favorite books you'd like to suggest. So if any of you do, would you like to unmute and share?
Oh, I was ready for this one. I literally have it right here. It's called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. I love it so much. I literally last project I had before I graduated was literally like on Asian American identity, like the and um, just and so I used that as a source, and it was just such a great read. I forget if it was in the book, but I also read an interview she did with The Atlantic, and it was in one of the two, where she talks about the idea of growing up sideways and how it was. She got this idea from a political social scientist about the idea of like queer identity and also growing up sideways, and it's kind of just the idea of it's not your typical expected all-American childhood, and so as a result, there are some shared experiences that you can find between immigrant children or children of immigrants or immigrant children shared among queer children. And I know I thought that was really cool, so definitely check it out.
I would recommend anything. I mean, not anything, because some things I know you said it was like a high school class, so I don't know like the maturity level of the readings. But Audre Lorde is an incredible writer. I love her, and she has a lot of poetry, but also has like a memoir that she calls like a like a mytho autobiography. It's like the coolest thing. It's called Zami, like Zami. And also Gloria Anzaldúa is a Latinx lesbian writer, and she has a lot of incredible writings about like kind of being in the limbo of like being between two worlds and just living in the in-between as opposed to like living in one or the other at a time. So I love both of them.
I have two books that I'll recommend. One of them I just finished reading. It's called The Vanishing Half, and it talks about how two twin sisters were separated, left, right, okay, whatever. The Vanishing Half talks about how two twin sisters left their mom at 16 years old, and they ran two separate lives. One of them passes of white and goes into Los Angeles and lives a lavish lifestyle, and the other one marries someone who is darker skinned, and they have a child, and that child gets bullied all throughout school because I live in a town where every Black person is light skinned, and it talks a lot about colorism, and it's a really good book. And I'm also currently reading A Burning by I forget the author name, but that book is really good right now. And and this is a movie, but I recommend anyone to watch Rafiki, because that movie features two lesbian Kenyans, and that fits the entire archetype of what we're talking about, because this is the representation that I never got as a child. So those are my recommendations.
Okay, just bouncing off of that question, I'm really curious about what like role models you guys have that are like queer or immigrant, or just like people that you look up to. They can be like queer artists, as we were covering in our lesson plan, as I keep plugging, but like Rina Sawayama is definitely one of the emerging role models for me. So if you guys have any individuals in particular that you look up to and fall into this demographic, that'd be great.
I actually can't remember. I'm so sorry. I love you. Yes, brother. Fine. So I can't remember if they're actually first generation, but Chellaman is transmasc, genderqueer. He uses he, him pronouns. His family is Jewish and Chinese. He's deaf, and I started following him when he was very early into his testosterone treatment. So he was still very femme presenting. He's very open about when he presented as a femme named Rachel. And he is the reason I learned that non-binary exists, genderqueer exists, and that does not mean I would need to default to neutral pronouns or neopronouns, and that I could still use binary ones. However, it also demonstrated a really open and communicative relationship between him and his parents, because this transition is something he's waited for since he was a toddler. He always wanted to have his hair cut short and buzzed off. He's mentioned before in stories that when he was younger, people would call him the boy named Rachel. And seeing that development and family acceptance was really nice. The fact that he's an artist, he's written a book now, he's an actor, he was in Justice League actor, model. He's such an open and outspoken activist, and I've appreciated that and internalized that with myself.
If you're a fan of Top Chef, Melissa King was in the most, not the current season, but the season before. She won, and I don't know. I think it's really cool just to. She's a queer. Her daughter of an immigrant. Daughter of immigrants. She's she/they pronouns, and I don't know. I think I just love her content. I follow her on Instagram, and she's always consistently talking about just her identities as a first generation American and as a queer woman. And she does a lot to raise money for organizations that support those two communities. And yeah, I love anything that combines media or food with those. with talking about marginalized identities. So definitely check her out.
Okay. Oh, sorry guys. Okay. And to wrap things up, we have one last question. So if you could give anyone advice on dealing with reconciling our identities or their identities, and conversely, any advice you would give to your younger self about navigating these identities, please share.
I'll say something. It's okay to not use labels initially or at all, because I feel like sometimes using labels is kind of confusing. But if you like using labels, then go off, sure, do your own thing. And also, it's okay for your identity to change. Like I thought for a while I was a lesbian, then I realized I'm bisexual and I can't, and that's okay. And thankfully it wasn't out to anyone, so I didn't have to re-come out again. But yeah, just keep yeah. And also the questioning process is honestly the hardest process. And once you figure out your identity, life gets so much easier from there.
So I'm gonna say your queerness does not need to look like somebody else's queerness. Your timeline is definitely not gonna be the same as somebody else's, because there's a lot of disconnects between when you feel and think certain things and wonder about them and actually find out what they correlate with, or that they're things that other people think and feel as well. But whatever you're feeling and thinking, however it changes, whatever timeline it takes, even if it's annoying and goes into when you're like in your senior years, because it be like that sometimes, and that's okay. You're completely valid, and that doesn't change any of it. If people try to invalidate you or be like, but that's not how it's supposed to be, there's no blueprint for how it's supposed to be. So I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Perhaps rent a train or a large object, and maybe I shouldn't encourage that. You get where I'm going with this. If they don't support you or are trying to invalidate you, whether it's maliciously or with care, it is not your job to justify yourself and explain yourself to them, because sometimes you can't even explain yourself to yourself, and that's okay.
One thing I would suggest and that really helped me was just having grown up only seeing like immigrant identities and queer identities very separated. Just like look into the history of like just queer identities in these communities. There is so much deep history that has just been really erased by colonization, and a lot of homophobic, like I guess, ideas centered around these communities are rooted in colonization. And I think it's a little more empowering to know that it's like kind of like a resistance to like the colonization, to be able to allow yourself to explore. Don't like, sorry, notifications. Just to not feel like you have to be one or the other. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it, but just like don't feel afraid to put yourself in one box. It's an active resistance to not have to. And also, just especially the internet can be a bit of a toxic place sometimes. There is a lot of discourse on there. Try It is easier said than done, but try to avoid it if you can. There are great spaces on the internet, but there are a lot of toxic ones. And I think when you're just figuring stuff out, if you can avoid it at least a little, it can just help a lot in the long run.
I just want to share something that my therapist like ingrained into my brain, which is like wherever you go, there you are. And like you're the only person that's really going to be with you. Like it's just basically like regarding like escapism and like I'm the only person that I'm going to be with for the rest of my life. So like every single moment that I spend like like allowing someone else to tell me how to live my life or like how to enjoy my own existence is conversely like a moment that I'm preventing myself from like spending that time enjoying my existence and loving myself. And it's like easier said than done, and sometimes like being neutral about yourself is an easier like intermediary step. um but yeah, like you're the only person that you're gonna spend the rest of your life with. um so everyone else can mind their own business basically.
I think that was a perfect note to end on. Also, everyone take a look at B's screen real quick because they're sharing their dog. And I think that's also very important, as all of your identities are. So yeah, thank you to all of our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. They're all amazing, wonderful people. And yeah, had a really good time today. I hope you guys did too. And yeah, Anusha dropped the presentation link in the chat. But whenever you guys are ready, you're free to go, or you just like chill, hang out with us. But yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you guys. We appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.
Not to be gay, but I was gonna say Mitski.
Girl. Yeah.
Not to be gay or anything.
Mitski's on our playlist, our lesson plan playlist for like queer immigrant, our lesson. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, she's on. If you, we'll add those artists that you guys, if you have anyone in mind, we'll put her on the playlist.
Yes.
Does Dawn have Spotify playlists?
We
No.
made one
Wait, does it?
for our lesson plan.
Yeah, we did. That would be a great idea though.
That's
Who
what I mean.
is the like actor that you plug?
Me?
Yeah.
Chella Man, Chella, and then Man, Man.
Thank you.
Yo.
Oh, thank you all for being here. That was so much fun. You guys were so fun.
What you mean?
This is such a good
Not me
panel.
almost not the recording still going on.